We live in an era saturated with psychological language. We can name our attachment styles. We can describe our triggers. We can talk about trauma, boundaries, emotional regulation, cognitive distortions. Modern psychology has given us remarkable insight into individual mechanisms. We understand reinforcement learning. We understand predictive processing. We understand attachment theory and narrative identity formation. But insight into parts is not the same as understanding structure. We know mechanisms. We do not always understand how those mechanisms organize into a system. And without that integration, insight remains episodic. In this presentation, I want to explore a structural approach to psychology, not another technique, not another coping strategy, but a framework for understanding how mind, emotion, identity, and meaning interlock. Because psychology does not simply need more advice, it needs architecture. Psychology today is sophisticated and empirically rich. Its advances have come through specialization. Cognitive science studies predictive processing. Affective science studies emotional regulation. Attachment theory maps relational development. Narrative psychology explores identity construction. Existential psychology addresses meaning and mortality. Each domain is deeply developed, but they are often studied and applied in parallel rather than in integration. The result is fragmentation. We understand how avoidance reduces distress in the short term, but we don't always examine how repeated avoidance reshapes identity across time. We understand attachment insecurity, but we don't consistently analyze how identity centralization increases structural fragility. We understand meaning making as coping, but we may not examine how erosion of value hierarchy alters emotional reactivity and perception. These mechanisms interlock. When they misalign, the result is not simply anxiety, shame, burnout, or collapse, it's structural distortion. Most contemporary discourse treats struggle as a collection of symptoms: overthinking, jealousy, imposter syndrome, dysregulation. But symptoms are expressions. They are surface manifestations of deeper organizing patterns. Without examining organization, intervention remains narrow. We adjust the behavior, we challenge the thought, we regulate the emotion, but we may leave the architecture intact. And when architecture remains unchanged, patterns recur. The question becomes, what is organizing what? Structure is not rigidity, it is organization. In psychology, structure refers to the patterned way multiple systems coordinate across time. A building, you see, is not defined by its materials, but by how those materials distribute weight and absorb pressure. The same is true of psychological systems. Cognition, emotion, identity, and meaning are interacting domains that carry psychological load. When they align, a person experiences coherence. When they misalign, strain appears. The strain may show up as anxiety or shame or collapse, but it's structural before it's symptomatic. Structural thinking asks, how does perception influence emotional activation? How does emotional activation reinforce identity attribution? How does identity orientation shape meaning hierarchy? How does meaning structure attention and salience? Psychological architecture proposes four core domains: mind, emotion, identity, and meaning. The mind domain governs predictive modeling and interpretation. The emotion domain governs salience and motivational signaling. The identity domain stabilizes narrative continuity across time. The meaning domain organizes value hierarchy and existential direction. These domains are dynamically interdependent. Change in one reverberates through the others. Structure is the pattern of those interactions. When intervention targets only one domain, relief may feel temporary. Take emotional avoidance. Avoidance reduces distress in the short term, but repeated avoidance reshapes reinforcement probability, increases threat salience, narrows meaning orientation, and reinforces identity fragility. The system reorganizes around relief. Addressing behavior alone may not recalibrate that structure. The same dynamic appears in identity collapse. When identity centralizes around a single role, that role becomes the axis of worth and time structure. If it destabilizes, distress follows, not merely as emotion, but as structural disorientation. Meaning destabilizes, perception narrows, emotional reactivity intensifies, narrative coherence fractures. Treating only the emotional expression misses the architectural shift. Fragmentation produces a cycle: symptom, intervention, relief, recurrence. Not because psychology lacks sophistication, but because the system was never examined as a system. Psychological architecture formalizes structural integration. It doesn't replace existing theories, it organizes them. Human experience is consistently structured across four interdependent domains: mind, emotion, identity, meaning. To articulate specific structural mechanisms, the framework includes models such as the emotional avoidance loop, how short-term relief reshapes reinforcement and narrows adaptive range; the identity collapse cycle, how role over-centralization creates fragility and destabilization; the self-perception map, how repeated interpretation consolidates identity attribution; the emotional maturity index, the capacity to tolerate activation without defensive restructuring; and emotional repatterning, the conditions under which new emotional learning integrates across domains. Each model isolates a structural mechanism. Together, they form a coherent system. The goal is coherence. Human beings do not suffer in compartments. Anxiety is not only emotion, it is perception weighted toward threat, identity interpreting that threat as deficiency, and meaning organizing the future around anticipated failure. Shame is not only a feeling, it is identity attribution reinforced through salience and stabilized through narrative. Role collapse is not only grief, it is loss of organizing axis. Structural literacy changes intervention. Instead of managing symptoms alone, we examine configuration. Instead of regulating emotion alone, we recalibrate salience, narrative, identity, and meaning simultaneously. Structural recalibration is slower, but it's durable. And this applies beyond individuals. Institutions centralize identity around metrics. Cultures amplify salience toward threat. Organizations orient meaning toward short-term reward. The same four domains scale upward. Fragmented systems destabilize. Integrated systems endure. Structure determines resilience. Resilience is not absence of pressure. It's the capacity to absorb pressure without distortion. We live in a moment saturated with psychological vocabulary, but vocabulary without integration produces noise. Mind, emotion, identity, and meaning are not competing explanations. They are interlocking domains. When they align, flexibility emerges. When they misalign, strain appears. Psychological architecture is an attempt to formalize that alignment. Because human beings are not collections of symptoms, we are organized systems, and systems require architecture.